Good afternoon, and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club. I'm Kirk Hansen, Executive Director of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara, a member of the Silicon Valley Advisory Board for the Commonwealth Club, and your moderator for this evening. This program is part of the Commonwealth Club's series on ethics and accountability, underwritten by the Charles Travers family. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Gloria Duffy, President and CEO of the Commonwealth Club, who today will speak on the topic, Getting Things Done, Resolving Our Most Difficult Issues in the 21st Century. At a time when political divisions make progress in addressing difficult issues rare across our country, Dr. Duffy is going to take us inside 5 public policy dilemmas in which she has been personally involved and describe the approaches that have resulted in success and moving forward. The cases range from an environmental conflict over San Jose's Central Park to handling sexual misconduct on a college campus to removing nuclear weapons from the former Soviet Union. Let me say just a bit more about Dr. Duffy, who most certainly understands how to overcome difficult challenges. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and Special Coordinator for Cooperative Threat Reduction during the first term of the Clinton administration. And in this capacity, she negotiated the denuclearization and dismantling of weapons of mass destruction in the former Soviet countries of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and provided $1.5 billion in U.S. assistance to these countries. She was awarded the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service. She's founded and headed 2 international affairs organizations, Global Outlook and the World Forum of Silicon Valley, and has served in positions at the RAND Corporation, the MacArthur Foundation, Plowshares Fund, the Arms Control Association, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace at Stanford University. She holds a PhD and master's from Columbia University and an AB from Occidental College. Please welcome Dr. Gloria Duffy.
Thank you, Kurt. A big thanks to my friend and colleague of almost 40 years, Kirk Hansen, who himself has done so much for the study and practice of ethics throughout his career. I could say thank you for inviting me to speak here at the Commonwealth Club, but that wouldn't exactly be appropriate since I'm here anyway. But I thank you all for coming out this evening on a rainy night for this discussion about getting things done. Often here at the club, we talk about our society's most challenging problems: healthcare, immigration, gun violence, the economy, climate change, North Korea, Russia, and so forth. These are certainly individually very serious problems. But we also have an overarching issue today, which is our inability to make progress in dealing with problems like this. The process by which we have historically gotten things done in public policy and public life, including addressing such serious challenges, is not being very effectively utilized today. So today I'm going to discuss the connection between the values, attitudes, and ethics that we as a society bring to public policy and our ability to effectively address our most difficult problems and get things done. In my experience, the values and ethics behind how we approach issues determines how effective we are in addressing them. Choices of ethics and values face leaders at every level, in every part of society, every day. In business, nonprofits, government, education, religious institutions, the arts, and elsewhere, leaders constantly confront questions of choosing the right things to do and the right ways to do them. In today's environment, I'm afraid, our society's best values, such as mutual respect, collaboration, equity, and reciprocity, are sometimes in disfavor. They seem to be regarded by some people as dispensable, fuzzy-headed, naive, too much trouble, and not able to produce effective outcomes. Quite to the contrary, I started thinking about this, about my personal experiences in solving difficult problems. And quite to the contrary, in my own experience, making choices that represent a strong ethical stance is not just right, but in the long term, approaches that are inclusive and based on values like empathy, respect, reciprocity, and collaboration make good business, good policy, good strategy, and lead to the most successful outcomes. So over the last 40 years, I've been fortunate to serve in some leadership roles in some very challenging situations, ranging from local civic issues to national and international problems. And in each case, I've found that the choices and approaches reflecting our best values have been the most successful in addressing these problems. I'm going to describe 5 varied challenges in which I've been involved, how each one was addressed, and how following our best values enabled solutions to the problems. First, let's talk about what has been called loose nukes in the former Soviet Union, which is certainly the most dramatic problem that I've been involved in addressing. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before. In 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, nuclear weapons were left in 4 countries: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. It was like a game of musical chairs. When the music stopped, that is, when the Soviet Union dissolved, whatever assets were on the territories of the different Soviet republics were just left there. The Soviet government disappeared almost overnight. And in all the countries except Russia, all the assets, including nuclear weapons, were under the administration of brand new governments. That amounted to thousands of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, their delivery systems, the military personnel that supported them, and the bases at which they were deployed. These countries were barely organized as new states and had no experience of safely holding or securing nuclear weapons. In addition to the danger of 3 nuclear countries on the world stage, all of them besides Russia, there was a danger that terrorist groups could obtain the weapons due to these countries' lax security as brand new states. In a traditional approach to dealing with this problem, against the background of the Cold War, the U.S. would have built more nuclear weapons or defensive systems for ourselves in order to combat this new threat of 4 nuclear states where the Soviet Union had been just 1. We would have perhaps threatened sanctions if these several countries retained the nuclear weapons on their territories, and promised to retaliate if they sought to use them for influence or military purposes. We might have seen a pattern similar to the threats and counter-threats now going on with North Korea. Instead, something very different happened. Former Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia, chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee at the time, who's a very smart and perceptive man, visited Russia in the summer of 1991. He found then-President Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in the Crimea during an attempted coup. Senator Nunn thought, with the Russian president out of control of the government, who had the button? Who had the codes and the authorities controlling the Soviet Union's tens of thousands of nuclear weapons? What would happen, he wondered, if the Soviet Union broke up and lost control of its nuclear weapons? Senator Nunn returned to the U.S. and talked to some of his network of experts in the national security field about this problem. He stimulated some foundations, especially the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and some universities, Stanford and Harvard, to figure out ways that we could address this problem of loose nukes. The funders and scholars developed a concept called cooperative threat reduction, or preventive defense, in which the U.S. would directly assist these prospective new nuclear states to dismantle their nuclear weapons, and in the case of all countries besides Russia, to become non-nuclear weapon states. Nunn immediately enlisted his Republican colleague, Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana, and the two introduced bipartisan legislation for cooperative threat reduction with the former Soviet countries. The legislation passed in December of 1991, creating what came to be called the Nunn-Lugar program. Their legislation allowed the U.S. to spend $400 million a year from our defense budget on dismantling nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons in the former Soviet Union, and it assigned the task primarily to the Department of Defense, a new way to approach our defense. The idea was to prevent this new threat to the U.S. and other nations from developing, rather than just reacting to it once it occurred. Using our funds to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons by directly engaging the countries involved was a novel approach. It represented long-term thinking, an effort to prevent threats before they became inevitable. When President Clinton and Vice President Gore came into office, several of the thinkers Nunn and Lugar had stimulated to design this new approach joined his administration, including Dr. William Perry, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur associated with Stanford, as Secretary of Defense, and Dr. Ash Carter of Harvard as Assistant Secretary. I was invited to the Defense Department to work with them because of my expertise on nuclear arms control and experience with the former Soviet Union, to coordinate the U.S. agencies involved in the project and negotiate with officials in the former Soviet countries. The efforts that followed were very intensive. The program required cooperation within U.S. agencies, between agencies, with other governments to figure out what needed to be dismantled, how to do it, to convince the leaders of the new countries in the former Soviet Union to undertake these actions, and then to get the job done. In the Pentagon, where I worked, this effort was sometimes counterintuitive to what the Department of Defense had previously been doing, which was to build weapons, train troops, and fight adversaries. We sometimes had to convince our own internal colleagues that it was a worthwhile and high-priority effort. There were also challenging domestic politics. We had opposition in Congress. Some members of Congress wondered, why weren't we spending these funds in their districts? Why were we spending them way over in the former Soviet Union? They launched General Accounting Office investigations of the Nunn-Lugar program. We had to weave together the various agencies and interests in the United States in order to make this novel effort work. There were many challenges on the international front. The new governments of the former Soviet countries were often disorganized, and sometimes different agencies were competing within their governments about who should be talking with us and who is in control of national security and nuclear weapons. The Ukrainian parliament passed legislation stating that they were keeping the 1,700 nuclear weapons on their territory. There was a legacy of suspicion about U.S. intentions in the former Soviet Union left over from the Cold War, so we had to build trust with them. To accomplish our goals of denuclearization of the 3 non-Russian countries and reduction and protection of the remaining nuclear weapons in Russia, the U.S. engaged directly with the 4 countries involved. In my case, I made over 40 trips to the region in a 30-month period, the largest number of them to Ukraine, which was the most difficult country for us to deal with. At one point, I even appeared on TV in Ukraine to explain to the Ukrainian public why their country would benefit from being nuclear weapons free. This effort took several years, 50 negotiated agreements, and quite a lot of U.S. foreign assistance, some billions of dollars. The U.S. got involved in meeting the internal political and economic needs these countries had to satisfy before they could dismantle their nuclear weapons and facilities. In the case of Ukraine, we helped them take care of their servicemen from the nuclear missile bases that were slated to close with the withdrawal of the weapons, since they had nowhere to house these servicemen. In Belarus, we helped with job training for their servicemen from the nuclear bases that were to close when the weapons were removed, since Belarus had high unemployment. In Kazakhstan, we assisted with some programs related to damage from nuclear testing on their territory, facilitating whatever they needed in order to make the internal decisions to give up the weapons. In the end, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan were convinced to become non-nuclear, and all the nuclear weapons were removed from their territories within just a few years. Russia also undertook actions we requested, dismantling some of their weapons and better securing those left on their territory. Over time, we were able to eliminate 2,650 Soviet missiles and bombers capable of delivering nuclear warheads to the U.S., to see over 11,000 Soviet nuclear warheads dismantled, to better secure the warheads that were allowed to remain in Russia under a previous arms control agreement, to destroy 2 million chemical artillery rounds in Russia with 5,400 metric tons of lethal chemicals, to eliminate an anthrax biological weapons facility in Russia, and to better protect Russia's remaining nuclear material against terrorists. And so the threat to the U.S. of 3 additional nuclear powers with all of this weaponry was prevented. It was the approach, bipartisan, collaborative, both internally in the U.S. and internationally, and preventive rather than reactive, partisan, or confrontational, that led to this success. The second problem I'll discuss was related to the first one. When the USSR and its scientific structure crumbled, tens of thousands of scientists with critical knowledge about how to make weapons of mass destruction were left with no employment. This created a danger of proliferation of nuclear weapons through the dissemination of the scientific expertise. Former Soviet scientists could be lured to work with Iran, North Korea, or terrorist groups to develop weapons of mass destruction. The billionaire George Soros tried to address this immediately when the Soviet Union broke up. He handed out $500 emergency grants to 30,000 individual scientists in Russia. That was a fair amount of money in those days. But that was really not a long-term solution. They needed employment, they needed to support their families. So Representative George Brown, then chairman of the House Science Committee, sponsored legislation creating a new foundation under the National Science Foundation in the U.S. called the Civilian R&D Foundation, or CRDF. I was able to provide the initial $5 million in funding for the foundation from our budget at the Defense Department, which was then matched by George Soros for a total of $10 million to get this started. The purpose of CRDF was to pair weapons of mass destruction scientists in the former Soviet Union with colleagues in the U.S. for peer-reviewed scientific research and other collaborative science-based programs. They were thus drawn out of weapons sciences and into civilian projects that could have commercial, medical, or other non-military applications. Another purpose of CRDF was to connect the very significant scientific talent in the former Soviet Union that had been completely cut off during the Cold War by their government's restrictions on travel and contact with the West, to their colleagues, other scientists in the international scientific community. When I left the Defense Department in '95, I was asked to join the board of the CRDF, and then I chaired the board for 10 years. CRDF has funded hundreds of joint research projects in the basic and applied sciences, from mathematics to volcanology, leading to the employment of thousands of scientists in civilian research. It's drawn companies, universities, national labs, and venture capitalists into the effort. Among the results of the joint projects have been tuberculosis research, advances in methods for combating bioterrorism, practical and commercial projects, such as developing teeth whitening compounds and a better method of refrigeration for produce being transported. CRDF, which is now called CRDF Global, works now beyond the former Soviet countries and beyond weapons scientists, generally supporting international scientific collaboration on problems such as the linkages between cancer and HIV in South Africa, and has stimulated many other collaborative efforts. Due to efforts like this one, we did not see weapons scientists from the former Soviet Union working with other countries or terrorist groups to develop nuclear weapons. Once again, an approach that was insightful, intensive, collaborative, and preventative rather than reactive and confrontational produced results. The third issue, now we're going to come home to our local area here. The third issue is a more local one in San Jose, our neighbor city to the south, which is the 10th largest city in the country with 1 million residents. We think of San Francisco as the larger city. In fact, San Jose with some urban sprawl and growth, is now quite a bit larger than San Francisco. It used to be the hub of what was called the Valley of Heart's Delight, with canneries and commerce that served the surrounding orchards and farms. Now it's the hub of Silicon Valley, of course, together with San Francisco. So this story involves a river and the airport in San Jose. As aircraft grew in size and flights increased in frequency in the 1970s to many U.S. metropolitan areas, problems of noise grew in the residential areas adjacent to the airports. There were an increasing number of complaints and lawsuits stemming from the noise and vibration from the increasing number of flights with larger, more powerful aircraft. In 1979, Congress passed the Aviation Safety Act, containing a provision, Part 150, covering noise abatement. This required the Federal Aviation Administration to take actions to mitigate the noise from aircraft affecting neighborhoods surrounding airports across the nation. The actions could range from soundproofing buildings and homes to acquiring the land in the flight path of airports and removing the buildings. In San Jose, the growth of the city all around the airport meant that the airport approach zone was very close to residential areas. Under Part 150 of the Aviation Safety Act, the decision was made to purchase the land in the approach zone and remove all the homes and businesses in that part of San Jose. The process of removal began in the early 1980s. At the same time, the Army Corps of Engineers and the Santa Clara Valley Water District were ready to begin a flood control project on the Guadalupe River, which runs through and was periodically flooding downtown San Jose, and then flowed out through the airport approach zone to San Francisco Bay. These two federal projects for airport noise abatement and flood control made a unique resource, 250 acres, 1/3 the size of Central Park, with a river running through it, available in the middle of urban San Jose. The question was what to do with what was, by the late 1980s, this extremely valuable land. Tom McHenry, then the mayor of San Jose, set up the Guadalupe Gardens Task Force to recommend uses for the land to the city council, which I, living nearby, was appointed. We reviewed many proposals for the use of this choice land. Many of them were private uses, ranging from golf courses and motocross racing to commercial flower growing. But as a metropolis that spurted in growth with the growth in Silicon Valley and was prone to urban sprawl, in San Jose, few parks are accessible to those who live within the city. So the Guadalupe Gardens Task Force recommended making this area into a public park with diverse elements including bike and walking trails, ball fields, picnic areas, green swards, areas of drought-tolerant native grasses, a heritage rose garden of old roses, programs educating kids about the ecology of the river, a historic orchard to educate on the agricultural past of the valley prior to the technology industry, and an area commemorating the Olympic skating champions from our region, Peggy Fleming, Rudy Galindo, Christy Yamaguchi, and Brian Boitano, all of whom grew up in the South Bay area. There's also a cluster of restored old houses from an Italian neighborhood that were turned into restaurants and shops, and now a wonderful Rotary Club-funded play garden that allows special needs children to play with other kids with specially manufactured equipment for them, as well as a number of other unique features. So making this a diverse public park was a good and ethical choice reflecting public needs and interests, and an appropriate public use of the public funds from the airport, the FAA, and the city of San Jose that had been used to purchase the land. It invited engagement from the community, from rose gardeners to youth groups to the special needs community. A master plan was drafted and the development of some areas of the park started. So I left to serve in Washington to go do those things with the former Soviet Union in early 1993, returning to the Bay Area in '95. The park master plan had been approved by the San Jose City Council, development had advanced, and the task force had been turned into a nonprofit organization to partner with the city on the development of the park. A city councilman in whose district the park was located asked me to be the first president of what is now called the Guadalupe River Park Conservancy. We spent the next 2 years building the board, supporting continued development of the park, raising funds, and building the organization. This is like the Friends of Golden Gate Park, for those of you who know the analogous organization here. Towards the end of my time as chair, a serious conflict arose involving the flood control project along the river that threatened to derail the whole project. Thanks to years of advocacy by elected and community leaders, a pretty environmentally friendly approach had been required of the Army Corps of Engineers in San Jose than making a typical concrete channel. The local office holders had, starting with Norm Mineta as mayor of San Jose and on through the years, had convinced the Army Corps of Engineers to keep the stream a natural stream with riprap lining and some vegetation, and with concrete diversion channels to accommodate the floodwater rather than paving the entire river channel. But still, environmental issues arose regarding disruption of the riparian habitat that had existed there, warming of the water due to some removal of overhanging vegetation along the stream, and a resulting possible interference with spawning for native salmon and steelhead, which are native to the Guadalupe River and which are found there in small numbers. A coalition of environmental groups threatened a lawsuit that would have brought development of the Guadalupe River Park project to a halt. Seeing this project about to go off the rails, I contacted the Natural Heritage Institute, a public interest law firm here in San Francisco, now called Water Power Law, that was threatening to sue the Water District and to stop the project. And I helped get the players together, the Water District and the environmental groups, in a collaborative dispute resolution process. Once again, this was the right choice. They reached an agreement for $150 million of Water District funds to be spent on remediation of the streams and watersheds of the Guadalupe River and the streams feeding into it in the next 2 decades. And based on their settlement, the flood control project and the surrounding park moved ahead. And you can visit it today. It's there with the attributes I mentioned. Dedication by the City of San Jose to the public interest, collaboration, respect for differing views, and finding ways to bridge conflicts have been key to securing this important resource for one of the country's most rapidly expanding urban areas. Other cities did not follow such a process. I don't know how many of you fly in and out of Los Angeles very often. 40 years after it was cleared under the federal Provision 150 regulations, Los Angeles International Airport still has a ghost city of 430 acres sitting abandoned to the north and west of the airport. And you can see that today, too. The fourth problem is one of the thorniest we've been dealing with across the country over the past few years, and that is sexual assault on campus. I attended and am a trustee of a private liberal arts college in Los Angeles. Occidental College was one of the first colleges to be deeply embroiled in charges of sexual assault and complaints that the institution was not handling them appropriately. In 2013, attorney Gloria Allred represented a group of women students at Occidental who sued the college over its handling of their cases. And there were also 2 complaints filed with the Office of Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of Education, alleging that the college had violated Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. Campus sexual assault is a very complex issue. Some cases are out-and-out assault, such as a student climbing in another student's window and raping her. There was the egregious case of the Stanford swimmer who brutally raped a woman in 2015. These are crimes, and it's imperative to protect students and others on college campuses against them. Some cases, I learned by listening and going through many of these cases, are more challenging to categorize or apportion responsibility. Some incidents are exacerbated by alcohol, by behavioral trends among young people, by mental health issues, by the use of drugs and other factors. The individuals involved often have different views or sometimes cannot remember what happened during an incident. At Occidental, we resisted, although the administration and the board were under substantial attack by the students and the faculty and by lawsuits. We resisted reacting defensively to the attacks that were being leveled at us. Instead, our board focused on working very hard with the president and the stakeholders on campus to improve practices for handling sexual misconduct. The college hired a Title IX administrator, a Title IX coordinator, a victim advocate, and professionalized the investigation process. The board and the president listened to all sides, creating a dialogue between women board members and women faculty members who were often getting the first reports of incidents from their female students. We instituted educational programs for students on appropriate and inappropriate sexual behavior, starting with online training when they were first admitted as students before they even arrived on campus. We brought speakers to campus and educated about the definition of consent and the need for parties to obtain it prior to engaging in sexual activity. We coached students and staff on being active bystanders, intervening to stop sexual misconduct. We instituted better coordination with the LA police so that where criminal assault might have taken place, it was treated as such. We made sure alerts are disseminated when there's been an incident so students and other campus community members can protect themselves. And of course, we upgraded campus security. We increased mental health services on campus, and we still have work to do on educating about the effects, for instance, of alcohol on behavior. Occidental was no better or worse than any other campus in terms of sexual misconduct. But as a small college, it was understaffed and less professional than necessary to handle the problems that arose. And this has been a typical difference between smaller colleges and the large universities, some of whom have had this problem handled for quite a while. It took several years to remediate the situation. In 2016, after a 3-year investigation, Occidental was found not to have violated Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, and complimented by the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, whose spokesperson said that during their investigation, they had, quote, found a campus actively engaged in important work to satisfy Title IX responsibilities for all students, and, quote, where we had concerns, Occidental leaders committed to taking appropriate steps to ensure student safety. This is the spokesperson for the Department of Education speaking. I am grateful for Occidental's responsiveness while the investigation was ongoing, as well as its commitment to its students. It is not always easy to retain balance, especially with this issue, which is highly emotional and very difficult. But it was the right thing to do, listening, engaging all constituents, educating, and improving the process. Now, the fifth and final problem was another local issue concerning the Commonwealth Club. The club is a nonprofit, and we rented space for our operations for over 100 years. As downtown San Francisco rents continued to rise, the club decided in 2010 that we needed a home of our own to make our budget healthy and to sustain our existence. We located and purchased this beautiful waterfront site on the Embarcadero, looking out on San Francisco Bay. This site had been rejected for development previously due to a conflict between a developer and the unions in San Francisco. Our site has an important history for the labor movement, locally, nationally, and internationally. In the 1930s, our building was where the International Longshoremen's Union was founded and had its first union hall. In fact, approximately where we are right at this moment. It was where the famed labor leader Harry Bridges worked, and from where the July 5th, 1934 San Francisco dock strike was organized. The dock strike led to the killing of 2 strikers by San Francisco police on Bloody Thursday, right outside our building, and their funeral cortege assembled at our building for a solemn march down Market Street. Other unions struck in sympathy, creating a general strike in San Francisco. The labor strikes in San Francisco and other West Coast ports led to major national protections for labor rights through the Labor Reform Act of 1935. This legislation provided for the rights to collective bargaining, the right to union hiring halls, and the establishment of the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB. About 10 years ago, the Hines Corporation, a major real estate developer, had tried to develop this site into a 10-story, very environmentally sustainable office building. Hines approached the city of San Francisco for entitlements, its permits to develop, seeking a negative declaration of environmental impact. Environmental impact in California includes a historic review, a review of historical significance. The Hines Corporation claimed that nothing of historical significance had ever happened at this site. The unions didn't share this view and, in fact, rightly considered it an insult. The unions urged the San Francisco Board of Supervisors to reject the project, which they did. The site had been sitting empty for more than a decade when the club purchased it, with no indication on the building of the rich history that had taken place here. Immediately upon learning of the union history at the site, even before closing escrow, we sought an introduction to the International Longshoremen Union's leadership and appropriately included them in the process for development of the site. Harvey Schwartz, historian of the ILWU, who worked with us, I believe is here tonight. Are you here? Hi, Harvey. As our project moved forward, the club had some minor but stubborn opposition to our project that resulted in 2 hearings before the Planning Commission and 1 before the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. But instead of opposing our project, as it had appropriately been the case with the prior Hines effort, the unions were our partner in the project, gave us important historical material and context, and supported us along the way. We were proud to receive not only the union support, but 3 unanimous votes for our project, 2 from the Planning Commission and 1 from the Board of Supervisors. Reaching out, being inclusive, including and incorporating the union history were the right things to do, mainly because the history deals with important events in San Francisco and American history. It also helped with the success for our effort. So we've just finished 2 years of construction, and we had the grand opening of this first club-owned headquarters on September 12th. We were honored that Willie Adams, president of the San Francisco Port Commission and secretary-treasurer of the International Longshoremen's Union, spoke at our ceremony and unveiled a plaque on the outside of the building, which you can see on the Stewart Street facade. There is now a section on the club's website about the union history at our building, and information about the union history will soon come to digital screens in our building lobby. Rather than sitting empty, our site now educates about this important U.S. labor history, as well as providing a beautiful home for the Commonwealth Club and our civic activities. So, looking back on these 5 extremely varied issues, and you might wonder, how do I get into so much trouble or into so many situations involving difficult issues? In my experience, the most ethical and collaborative approaches have always been the most successful. Steering by the compass of these values, we have 3 less countries with nuclear weapons, thousands of weapons scientists who aren't helping terrorists or rogue states make weapons of mass destruction, a 250-acre park in the nation's 10th largest city, a college that was able to handle sexual misconduct in a way beneficial to the entire campus community, and a new home for the Commonwealth Club that has already brought groups in the community together and will continue to do so. I've had a small part in most of these activities, but others of like mind, like Senator Nunn and others, have led the way. So when you hear leaders indicating that berating, confrontation, demeaning others, denying the viewpoints and interests of others, and similar approaches are effective in solving the problems we face, don't believe it. Mutual disrespect and mistrust in a society is a slippery slope down which lies an inability to solve our problems. And considering the challenges we face with North Korea, Russia, climate change, immigration, healthcare, and so many more, that's a slope we can't afford to be on. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. We're here with Dr. Gloria Duffy, the president and CEO of the Commonwealth Club, and there are several questions, all on the same theme.
Okay.
Here are 5 cases where this approach worked wonderfully. What are the other 5 cases you faced where this approach did not work so wonderfully?
You know, I have to say truthfully that in all cases where I have had a role in the outcome, they have all worked. This approach has always worked. So that's why it struck me, thinking back on my own experiences. As I hear some of the discussion, you look at the ultra-partisanship in Congress, you look at, and the inability to get much done. I started thinking back on my personal experiences, and truly, every time I've been involved in solving a difficult, complex problem, these approaches have worked.
Now, we are at a time when there are many people who don't believe, as you are arguing, who believe that confrontation is the approach. If you're someone like yourself, or like hopefully most of the audience now is convinced by your appeal for this, that cooperation and collaboration is the way, what do you do with people who won't play ball, who won't take that approach?
What I don't mean to say there aren't situations in which force has to be used, pressure has to be used, lawsuits have to be filed. Toughness is the only way to go. We obviously, with a Hitler or another despot, situations where there's no negotiation. No negotiation is possible. You have to take a different approach. So I would not argue that every case can be solved through this kind of collaboration. I think many cases can be, you simply have to be creative in finding the way. I will tell you, there was one case I was brought, well, there are 2 cases where I was brought in to mediate that did not result so pleasantly. One of them was a back-channel effort to resolve conflicts in the mid to late 90s between the 3 Caucasus countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, all of whom have a large number of conflicts with one another. There are conflicts over territory. There are conflicts over religion. There are conflicts over the relationship with Russia. So there were a series of sort of track 2 meetings that took place in England and at Stanford, in which I had a part, that made an effort to, they were meetings with the national security advisors to the presidents of each of the countries. This was sort of encouraged by the Clinton administration, but it involved scholars and people. I had just left the government, people who were not in the government. And the conflicts there were simply too deep, and we had no authority or power to put any incentives out to really put pressure on to resolve the conflicts. This is like the war going on over Nagorno-Karabakh and several other actual conflicts. So there was an example where efforts were tried, but the problem was just too complex and too far away and too difficult. So not every problem is amenable to solution in this way. And again, I am not a person who believes that you don't have to use force or you don't have to use pressure in a situation where you're faced by a force that is intent on domination or imperialism or doing ill and must be combated.
2 of the themes you raised have provoked questions here around, number one, the inclusiveness How broad do you reach to bring people into the decision process who may be in opposition to it? And then some questions about the concept of the public interest and whether that still is valid and whether we can identify a core. So let's start with the inclusiveness.
Sure.
Do you bring everyone who wants a stake in a decision into the mix, or do you have to make tough decisions?
So often the problem is that important stakeholders who are important aren't at the table. So in the case of the Guadalupe River Park, a lawsuit was being threatened. It was emanating from a law firm here in San Francisco. It had a variety of groups, fish preservation groups and environmental and river support groups and so on, that weren't necessarily familiar with the political situation in San Jose, the players, and so on. So just calling them up directly and getting the sides talking to each other, they didn't know who each other were really, and they really weren't talking with each other. So sometimes you have to go the first step, which is just to bring the parties to the table who really are directly involved. Back to the example of nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union, at the beginning, dealing with Ukraine, we had a dance going on where the Ukrainians wouldn't let us come to talk to them. We kept requesting permission. We kept sending diplomatic cables, and of course they were a new government. They barely had their diplomatic process set up, and they just kept waving us off. And their parliament would make these statements, that they owned the nuclear weapons. So at one point, Les Aspin, who was briefly the Secretary of Defense, was on a trip to Russia, and he just diverted his plane and called into Kiev and asked if the Secretary of Defense of the United States could land in Kiev and meet with his counterpart, the brand new Secretary of Defense of Ukraine. So he reached out directly, and he came back and gave me the phone number of the Secretary of Defense. And we started calling up the Ministry of Defense ourselves, because the working through the diplomatic cables and the formal methods for requesting access were not working. So sometimes you just have to reach out and bring to the table directly those who are involved, much less involving many other constituencies.
But there's still some that
there are still some
that you can't work with.
I believe, again, that the table should be large. So in the development of this building and this site, the waterfront in San Francisco is a precious resource, and many people are interested in that. So we reached out not only to our friends at the unions, to the neighbors here, to environmental groups, to the businesses in this area, to everyone we could think of who had a stake in it. We all care about San Francisco's waterfront. It's a world-class resource. And so we cast the net widely, just talking to them, telling them, showing them plans for our building, talking to them about what we were doing, and soliciting feedback. So not everybody should be at the table, but a wide group should be consulted to find out what the people's views are, and also what stakeholders' views are, and also what they might have to contribute. They might have ideas. They might have improvements that you can utilize.
You used the term public interest several times in your presentation, and there's some today, and one of the questions that says, is there such a thing as the public interest today, or have we become so polarized that the views of the right and the left simply don't intersect at all?
I do believe there's a public interest, and again, just back to some of the examples, I sat through many hearings, public hearings, back in the late 1980s about this 250-acre swath of land in downtown San Jose. There were many proposals to privatize its use, and I still remember all of these, the motocross racing and the private golf course and all of that. Well, if public funds have gone to create a resource. And if there's a way of benefiting a broad public needs, then you need to follow that as the public interest. Now, again, that doesn't involve right and left and Republican and Democrat, but again, this is basic ethics, that if the public paid for something through their taxes, which were used to buy land or tear down buildings or whatever, then that land should be used for public uses. So there's sometimes a very clear relationship. I do believe that a public interest can be arrived at between left and right and Republican and Democrat. The Commonwealth Club was founded in 1903, coming out of what was called the Progressive Movement in California. The Progressive Movement held that however different the political ideologies and viewpoints were in California and the Bay Area, an area of common interest could be found, particularly in areas like environmental protection. The environment affects everybody, left, right, etc. Areas like public health. Public health affects everybody. So in many areas, I believe a public interest can be found, and agreement can be found. What we have today, unfortunately, is a kind of a gotcha culture where political elements don't want to cooperate because they can then point to the other side and blame the lack of a solution on the other side. So we need to move away from the gotcha culture back to the progressive culture, which believes that the human condition can be improved. That's what the progressive ideology is, really. It can be progressively improved by finding common ground.
For the audience on the radio, we're having this event the night, once again, Congress is negotiating over a 1-month extension, and there seems to be exactly what you illustrated. Each side would like not to be blamed for a shutdown or to take credit for finding the solution that prevented the shutdown.
Right. So we had an era of great compromisers in the U.S. Congress. These were people of extremely varying political philosophies, but their identity was around us finding a solution. So they made compromises, they found a third way, something neither side had thought of before, a way to fund it, a way to be creative, to get the job done. And no one had to give up everything. Each side got some of what they wanted. That's what we need in our politics today.
Bravo. We're here with Dr. Gloria Duffy, the CEO and president of the Commonwealth Club, talking about how we can bring solutions to the most difficult public problems. There are some who believe that, unfortunately, fewer and fewer people in public service or in positions of leadership in business or in nonprofits or elsewhere have this sense of a concept of the public interest, a concept of cooperation and collaboration and compromise, and that many more today are focused on whether it's their material success or re-election at all costs. Do you see that trend happening over the last 20 or 30 years?
Sure, I think we all see it. And again, we see a paralysis in solving problems. If you look at our inability to grapple with climate change, for instance, there's a clear common interest. There's clear documentation and scientific evidence at this point that it is happening. There are things, whether it's completely human caused or whether it's long-term trends in the weather, it really doesn't matter because the effects are the effects. It is happening. It's documented that the climate is heating up. That causes difficulties ranging from the waves lapping over the Embarcadero here, to species changing habitats that are changing in terms of being hospitable to species and so on. So the effects are the same. It doesn't matter what the cause is. There should be an ability to collaborate to mitigate those effects, come up with creative ways through public policy and technology and so on to mitigate the effects. So there are clearly issues on which collaboration should be possible for the common interest. That's going to affect everyone in terms of, people's beach houses falling into the ocean and whatever, there are many, many impacts that are negative economic impacts. They are negative societal impacts, and there should be an incentive to collaborate.
I resonate obviously with your use of the term ethical values that underlie this collaborative approach as an ethicist myself. The question is how we get from here to there. So what do we start doing that begins to turn the tide? What do we do with young people? What do we do with policymakers? What do we do with all of us as the general public?
Well, I think what I'm trying to say is ethics are good business. Ethics are successful. So if you think of these as ethical values, it's good to talk to other people. It's good to represent all interests and strive for the public interest. It's not just good because these are deeply held traditions or values according to our religious traditions or our philosophical traditions. They work. They really work. So I think embody those values. It's not just a matter of teaching children that it's good to be tolerant and patient with other people and listen to them and draw in their interests. It works. If you want to be successful in dealing with some big issues and solving problems, it works. There's a reason that our society was constructed the way it was as a democracy, with different constituencies, with a force impelling towards compromise. That's all built into our system. It's all there for us to use. It is what succeeds.
And of course, you can imagine there are a couple of questions about, but if there were someone in a very high position in government who was resistant to a collaborative or a fact-based approach, how would one deal most effectively with that if one were in Congress or whatever?
Sure. Well, again, we see other initiatives underway in the country. More regional and local creativity in solving problems. That's key. You have to solve problems at the level and with the people that you can do it with. So I think California is charting a very good course, whether it is to stay at the forefront on dealing with climate change by having our own policies and incentives and climate change policies in California, or some of the talk about trying to ameliorate what may be some of the negative effects of the recent tax bill by allowing some of the payment of state taxes into a fund for charitable purposes. California has a pretty creative approach to operating and trying to solve problems at a more local level and not relying on the federal government. So I think that's one strategy. And what I've always found is citizens taking decision-making or action into their own hands. It's a good thing. Again, if you see a problem, reach out to somebody on the other side of the problem and try to talk to them and try to get something done.
Let's talk in this last couple of moments about how we reach the youth, because I know that's been a great interest of yours with your involvement with Occidental as a trustee and with other educational programs. Well, what should we be doing in our undergraduate programs to help spread this kind of concept? Because certainly at Santa Clara or Occidental or Berkeley or Stanford, we see some of the elements of polarization that exist in Washington.
Well, I think you do terrific work through the Markula Center and what you've done at Santa Clara University. You've really nurtured teaching and learning about ethics. For better or worse, we find this more in the context of religious institutions now than we do anywhere else. So a Jesuit university considers that a very important part of its mission.
I've spent half my career, as you know, at Stanford and
Right.
now at Santa Clara. It's easier to do it. The students are more receptive. The other faculty are more receptive
Right.
in a Jesuit university context.
Right. So there is a role for, in education, I think teaching kids ethics at all levels, down to it's probably middle school or so, if not before, is important. So you can pose many choices and many dilemmas to kids. What would you do about this? And then try to use that to teach what the values are. And again, I argue what succeeds. I think more study of what leads to success. It's not just the values, but it's that the values produce a certain success. So I think all those are parts of it. Certainly the churches have a role, although not that many kids are attending church or Sunday school anymore. The public schools and private schools all have a role. Ethics, as you well know, having taught it, can be taught. And those values have to come from somewhere. But there can also be, from a social science standpoint, study of how these approaches work.
There's a very interesting, provocative question. Where did your values come from? Can you share with us some of the formation of your positive attitude towards compromise and collaboration and such?
And I will say that some may regard me as slightly Pollyanna-ish. My friend and former roommate, Condi Rice, was interviewed about me for a magazine article, which is a little bit of a twist in that I'm usually interviewed about her. But when I went off to Washington in the Clinton administration, and she was quoted as saying, "Gloria really thinks that anything can be accomplished," kind of in a wondering way. I had a good upbringing. I had in the Methodist Church, the Lafayette Methodist Church in the town where I grew up. My great uncle was a Methodist minister. So my grandmother, his brother, lived in our home, and so she made sure that I went to Sunday school, and so I learned those basic values there. I would say they were reinforced all through my schooling. And also, as I got out and started getting involved in public policy projects, I began to see how they worked. I mean, again, I'll just cite one influence. In Lafayette, where I grew up, some friends and I in my high school felt, and this is in the late 60s, that there were too many drugs going on among our friends, and too little for suburban kids to do in this wealthier suburb. There was a certain ennui, a certain sort of shiftlessness a bit among some of the kids. And there was no place to go. The town was very quiet. You couldn't go to San Francisco or Berkeley, without a car. And so we decided that we thought there needed to be a youth commission that planned activities on the city level, that planned activities and thought about this question. And so we approached the mayor of Lafayette. This is a friend and I from my high school. And he's a very smart guy who later became the president of the San Francisco Foundation, president of John F. Kennedy University, and had many roles. And he said, okay, so talk to every member of the city council, go find the nonprofit or public organization that does something the most similar to what you want to do, find a kid from the other high school in town, and he basically taught us how to go out and build a constituency. And then he said, when you've done all those things, then come back. So we did, and it's called the Lafayette Youth Services Commission, and it still exists and does very good work. You can read all about it on the internet, and does volunteer work and hosts social events and so on. So that was 40 some years ago. Yep. It had legs. It's lasting. It lasted, I think, because of the way that we went about it. So Bob Fisher, my old friend, who was the mayor of Lafayette, taught my friends and I how to go about this, and it worked. It's still there. It's still going strong. So many influences out in the public arena, in school, in church.
I think the lesson for all of us to take is how important it is to give young people experiences in doing that kind of, and you could call it politicking, or you could call it collaboration, you could call it listening to others, the interests of others, but how critical those experiences are. And of course, there's more and more emphasis on that in college today, with giving students concrete experiences in internships or engagement with nonprofits or government agencies or whatever.
I think it's really important to support any young person who wants to get involved in that way, whether it's in your business, your community organization, supporting them. There have been some very young people who have run for public office. In Berkeley, there is an 18-year-old who ran, I think, is it for the city council? There have been some very young people wanting to get involved, and I think they should be given whatever support we can.
Wherever your values came from, Gloria, we have benefited in your solving so many interesting and thorny problems in your own career. We thank you for your talk tonight. It's been my pleasure to chair this session this evening. Thank you once more to Dr. Gloria Duffy, President and CEO of the Commonwealth Club. We also thank everyone here as well as our audience on radio, television, and the internet. This program has been part of the Commonwealth Club's series on ethics and accountability, underwritten by the Charles Travers family. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirk.